is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Juliet Mann. Our top stories this hour. Bridging half a century, China and the UK mark 50 years of full diplomatic relations. We look at where the future's headed. Russia widens its offensive in Ukraine, striking a military base near Poland, killing dozens. And tens of thousands gather in Berlin and Frankfurt to call for an end to the war in Ukraine. Well, we'll have the latest from Ukraine a bit later in the programme, but first, 50 years of diplomatic ties are being celebrated today by China and the UK. Both countries exchanged ambassadors for the first time in 1972, when Mao Zedong and Ted Heath were leaders. Since then, trade relations have increased significantly, and China's currently the UK's third biggest economic trading partner. Yellow Up David reports.
China's exports are familiar to many in Britain, beyond well-known tourist areas. An event to celebrate China-UK relations, as well as looking forward to the future, was held in London. It comes at a time when international trade is being revived after 2 hard years.
For half a century, this relationship has overcome various disruptions and obstacles and made historic progress. History tells us that cooperation serves the fundamental interests of both China and the UK.
China Media Group will continue to be a bridge of communication to contribute to the golden era of lasting, open and win-win China-UK relations and the building of a community of common destiny for mankind.
New nuclear power stations are a long-term goal for British governments. Energy security is crucial as war continues in Eastern Europe. Chinese investments in 2 nuclear sites in the UK are seen as vitally important. Later this year, the UK's Department for International Trade hopes formal talks will restart to build on past experiences.
We're at the crossroads where the West and the East are meeting, and that is not a simple contact process. It's a process which is quite complicated, and where we really need people of vision.
There are differences which are difficult for both governments. The UK wants China to do more to stand up for Ukraine's territorial integrity. China wants both sides to negotiate and resolve their differences peacefully.
The whole story of Chinese civilization should be open to as many people as possible in the West. And we should encourage people to understand something of the pattern of the Chinese past, which informs the present so much.
The UK will be keen to retain a balance at a time of international tensions and maintain diplomatic relations between Beijing and London, especially as UK exports to China are expected to increase by more than 3% this year. Yolo Abdavid, CGTN, London.
The China-UK relationship has become somewhat frosty in recent years as both sides bicker over issues like Hong Kong and Xinjiang. Well, former UK Deputy Prime Minister Lord Michael Heseltine tells CGTN that those disagreements shouldn't hamper future cooperation.
I hope that as China now consolidates its position as a world power, it will increasingly realise the interdependence of the shrinking world. There are so many issues of which we share a common purpose, self-evidently, many of them associated with environmental policy, where China has a critical role to play. But there are all the strategic issues with the incidental examples of things that can go wrong. Arguments about some of the islands in the South China Sea, for example, but patently much bigger issues surrounding Hong Kong and Taiwan. So inevitably, as one knows from any study of history, journeys tend to be strewn with rocks. we must recognize that in our time, the dangers of conflict that arise from such tensions are terrifying on a scale never seen before. So I think that Britain has an important role to play in maintaining the best possible dialogue with China. It won't always be easy because there are conflicts inevitably in the industrial world and in China's emergence as a world power. But that argues we should try harder rather than give up the task.
Trade has always been the linchpin of China-UK relations. CGTN asked the UK's former Business Secretary Vince Cable where he thinks economic ties head next.
The main problem is British companies gaining access to Chinese markets, and of course everything has been very disrupted by the COVID pandemic. There is also the danger of, geopolitical forces getting in the way of sensible relationships, and we must hope that this doesn't happen. I think within Europe there is a general feeling that we need to have a business-like working relationship with China, and I would hope that continues. I would hope that we don't retreat into protectionism and nationalism. There are very strong forces in the world making countries turn inward and to decouple. I think that's bad for cooperation, bad for living standards. We have to continue to make the case for, rational behaviour and mutual cooperation. I don't want things to deteriorate. I mean, we had a warning a few years ago in terms of relationships with Huawei. I strongly favoured the compromise arrangement that the British government had negotiated, but it wasn't to be. And I would hope that we don't have more repetitions of that kind of experience.
China has long been a leading source of international students in the UK. There are now more than 200,000 of them in Britain. So what is it that's drawn them here?
I feel like living in the UK, people are more open-minded.
Generally speaking, people are more friendlier.
London is a very attractive city, and I want to just get through more ideas of the international views.
I actually really like the weather here. Some people don't like the weather, but look at it today.
I can just sit on any of the park and chat with my friend, enjoy the beer.
I love living in the UK is to meet up with a lot of college friends and having fun with them.
Lots of free museums, so there's always so much to see.
Really helped me to have more strength and confidence to face the difficulties in my life.
Still ahead on CGTN, dozens killed in an airstrike on a Ukrainian military training base near the Polish border. We have all the very latest on the war in Ukraine.
The British public not only need to know, but really want to know more about China.
70 years ago, a small group of British businessmen travelled to China to unlock opportunities between the two countries. They became known as the icebreakers.
East meets West. We're now at a time when we need the icebreaker spirit.
My first impression when I came to China is I noticed the similarities more than the differences.
It's about understanding each other's culture.
We look at the things that bring our nations together.
My dad is Chinese, my mum is English. I grew up in London, but I went to China to work at age 25.
Whenever I've gone to China, it's just been amazingly welcoming.
The music is beautiful language and bringing all the people together.
I'm exploring, I'm experimenting, I'm trying something new, all in the hopes to build a bridge. And I think we definitely need more people doing that.
So it was only when I got to know my Chinese father in my 40s that I really got to know the other half of myself.
I hope we make it another 50 years, another 500 years.
Join us on March the 13th as we mark the 50th anniversary of China's full diplomatic relations with the UK, as we launch our special To the Future Together on CGTN.
I hope that you will all become icebreakers and bridge builders.
Welcome back. Well, Ukraine says some 30 missiles from Russia have been fired at a military base near its border with Poland. The Yavoriv base is the most Western-based target so far since Russia launched its offensive on Ukraine 18 days ago. Ukrainian officials say dozens have been killed in the attack on the facility, which is usually used for training with NATO instructors. Our correspondent Michael Voss is in Lviv for us. Michael, can you tell us a little bit more about Russia's military offensive? It just seems to be grim news after more grim news.
Yes, it is moving further west and much closer to here. This military base, which was hit at Yavoriv, it's huge. It's about 400 square kilometers. It's called the Center for Peacekeeping and Security. And up until the start of the conflict, it's where NATO trainers were coming in to train the Ukrainian army, and where now it's training, the Ukrainians are training conscripts, the territorial army, if you like, volunteers coming forward to get a few days or a few weeks basic training before going off to the front. As you say, dozens. The latest figure we've had from the authorities there was 35 dead and 134 injured, and probably the most deadly attack on a single location so far. I think one of the worrying things about this is that just how close it is to the Polish border, about 25 kilometers. Had one of those 30 missiles overshot and landed in Poland, there's a real risk we could suddenly find NATO at war with Russia. One other thing I just wanted to add is news has come in of the first, what we believe is the first Western journalist to be killed in Ukraine. Brent Renaud, an award-winning American filmmaker, was killed just outside of Irpin, to the northwest of the capital, Kyiv. He was in a car with two others. He died. The other two journalists were shot, but they are now in hospital. Juliet.
Thank you for updating us on that, Michael. Now, Yavoriv, it's only around 50 kilometres from where you are in Lviv. What can you tell us about how people near and far are coping?
Well, people are getting a little more nervous. The air raid sirens are going off every day now, well, every night. This one, when this attack happened on the base, the air raid sirens here went off at about 3:30 in the morning, so a lot of people aren't getting very much sleep. This city itself has yet to be targeted. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a very beautiful city, but people are starting to take precautions just in case.
Historic churches are being boarded up and statues wrapped in protective cladding. The St. Peter and Paul Cathedral is where services are held for the military. This Sunday it was packed as people came to pray for victory and for those who've fallen fighting the Russians and the many civilian casualties. It was a service made more poignant after last night's attack on the Yavoriv military base, where relatives and friends were amongst the victims.
I'm here because I pray for our boys. I pray for our country to withstand and ask God to help us. Look at what happened in Yavoriv. Yesterday my son's friends, his classmates, went there, and today they're already dead. And they had two little 2-month-old children who won't even know how their fathers look. I haven't slept the whole night because of anxiety, and I came here in the morning to pray for them.
And amid the fear and uncertainty, one couple decided this was the time to get married. Their union blessed in the cathedral just before the main service began.
It's a symbolic gesture for us. We planned to get married in May, but the war had started and Volodya goes to the front tomorrow. So we decided to do it earlier because marriage and family ties make the relationship stronger.
Juliet, there's about 200,000 Ukrainian refugees actually staying here in Lviv. That's on top of the 1.5 million who've gone on to Poland. And the local mayor saying they are now struggling to cope. He'd like extra Western help, possibly to build some sort of tent city maybe, or prefabricated houses. But this city really has opened its arms to people coming in from other parts of the country. Juliette.
Michael Voss, thank you very much. Very touching to see those stories from real people on the ground. Well, protests are taking place across Europe against Russia's military action in Ukraine. Jailed Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny has also called for demonstrations in Russia. Well, Moscow's new media law severely limits what our correspondents in Russia are able to report. So let's talk to our correspondent Giles Gibson, who's in the Latvian capital, Riga. Giles, what do we know about these protests in Russia, how big they are, and also, I suppose, whether there are any crackdowns taking place?
Well, as we were expecting, really, there has been a really strong crackdown from the Russian police to this protest that was called for by that opposition leader, Alexei Navalny. Lots of pictures and video coming out on social media of protesters, not just in Moscow, but also cities around the country, being detained by police for trying to protest against this invasion. We've heard from an independent monitoring group that around 800 people had been detained in cities across Russia, and 350 of them just in the capital itself. I can tell you I was in Moscow almost exactly a week ago at the last time there was a call for this sort of a mass protest against the invasion, and it was a really similar story. You just had police as far as you could see, everywhere you could see, especially in the centre of the capital around the Red Square area. There have, however, been some very large protests in capitals and cities across Europe. We've seen thousands of people coming out onto the streets of the German capital, Berlin, to protest against the invasion of Ukraine, and also some protests organised in other cities such as Warsaw, Madrid and London.
Now, of course, the reason you're not still in Russia is because of those restrictions on the media. But can you also tell us about these significant moves in terms of censoring social media as well?
Yeah, so from Monday onwards, it's going to be very difficult, or Instagram is going to be blocked by the Russian authorities. The Russian media regulator explaining this decision has said that this platform is spreading calls to commit violent acts against Russian citizens and the Russian armed forces. We've had a response from Nick Clegg, who, of course, used to be the British Deputy Prime Minister. He is now in charge of public affairs at Meta, the parent company of Instagram and Facebook. He's saying that they believe at Instagram, at Meta, that Ukrainians have the right to talk about the self-defense of their country in reaction to a military invasion. This blocking of Instagram starting on Monday in Russia is coming off the back of Facebook already being blocked, and there's also been some restrictions placed on Twitter as well. So Russians' view of the outside world is just being restricted really every day that passes.
Charles Gibson, thank you for that update. Well, Mark Berenson is a senior lecturer with King's Russia Institute from King's College London, and he joins us now from Brighton. Thanks ever so much for coming on the programme. And just listening to our correspondent there, the censoring of social media, is there a precedent for this? What do you think it means?
This is the most restrictive suppression of the outside media that I think Russia has had for 30 years. And even during the Soviet period, many foreign newspapers and foreign news outlets still had access to Russia and covered Russia from Moscow. This is quite a different kettle of fish.
And in terms of what this means for prospect for a negotiated peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine, is there still hope, or what's your take?
Well, I think the two sides are very far apart here. We're talking about, on the Ukraine side, Ukrainians very much want to maintain hold over their own land and don't want a foreign-imposed government being placed upon them. And on the other end, we have sort of the demands that are coming out of Moscow and coming out of the Kremlin are, quite frankly, extremely restrictive, calling for a new government in Kiev, or a government in Kiev that will be subject to the whims of Moscow, as well as recognizing Crimea and other parts of Ukraine that Russia's already annexed and taken control over as being part of Russia itself. These are demands that Ukrainians have said they will not stand for. So because the two sides are so far apart, this likely is going to be a protracted conflict that will go on for quite a while. On the one hand, you have the Russian forces that are very well equipped in terms of military technology and weapons, and certainly have a lot of forces. On the other hand, you have the morale of the Ukrainian people who are willing to fight to the death to preserve their homeland. And in the long run, things like sanctions from the West, things like news getting infiltrated into to Russia itself are going to have an impact, but it's unlikely to lead to an impact immediately in ending the conflict because, quite frankly, it appears as if the conflict is being driven by Putin himself at the top of the system, and he surrounded himself with people that he trusts. He's not around people who would think differently from him or would stand up to him.
But that's the thing, isn't it? It's people who he trusts who won't necessarily stand up to him. And you talked about the long run. What will the potential impact of sanctions and isolation from the West be for Russia?
I think it's a very scary prospect. Certainly, Russia is going to be held to these sanctions, and Western corporate organizations are going to have already started to pull out. It's unlikely that they're going to be able to go back into the country and invest and provide other types of funding that Russia certainly needs to develop and to further modernize. Russia depends upon technology from the West. Being closed to that, and at the same time having oil and gas not being bought by a good portion of the world, will mean that Russia will be sort of left out in earning money over the next decade or so. At the end of that decade, roughly 10 to 12 years from now, we're going to see a different energy system in the world in which green energies are going to be replacing fossil fuels. And what will Russia have to offer at that point? It's a very scary prospect of having an impoverished country the size of Russia with the weapons that is retained from the Soviet era and being perhaps aggrieved just similarly to the way Putin was aggrieved when the Soviet empire collapsed in the beginning of the 1990s.
So a different energy picture and potentially a whole new world order. Mark Berenson, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Turkey is still trying to press ahead with its peace efforts, despite the breakdown of talks it hosted between the Ukrainian and Russian foreign ministers on Thursday. A three-day top-level diplomatic forum has just taken place, also in the southern city of Antalya, with Ukraine top of the agenda. Michal Bar-David has more.
The three-day Antalya Diplomatic Forum, which gathered 17 heads of state and dozens of government ministers from 75 countries to discuss recoding diplomacy, concluded on Sunday. In his opening remarks, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan reiterated Turkey's stance on Ukraine and criticized Western countries for their response to Russia regarding its annexation of Crimea 8 years ago.
Ukrayna'nın toprak bütünlüğünü hiçe sayan gayrimeşru adımları.
As Turkey, we reject the illegitimate steps that disregard Ukraine's territorial integrity. If the whole West had raised a clamour against the invasion of Crimea in 2014, would we be facing today's picture?
Acaba bugünkü tabloyla karşı karşıya kalır mıydı?
Regarding current reactions to Russia, NATO Secretary General stressed caution was vital.
We will not send NATO troops into Ukraine on the ground and not send NATO planes into the airspace of Ukraine, because that will most likely trigger a full-fledged war between Russia and NATO, causing much more damage and death than we see today, be even worse than the conflict we see today.
There were a variety of topics on the agenda here in Antalya. Panel speakers discussed many different issues, including pathways to peace, migration, Afghanistan, Eurosecurity and green economy. But one way or another, every discussion got connected to the conflict in Ukraine. During a panel discussion, EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Josep Borrell, stated that the conflict in Ukraine showed the EU it was too dependent on other countries and needed to rebuild their capacity for strategic autonomy. The refugee crisis triggered by the fighting in Ukraine was also discussed during talks. Latvia's Deputy Prime Minister Artis Pabriks commented that there was concern that if escalation continues, the burden may become unbearable for regional countries. Several bilateral meetings also took place on the sidelines of the forum. Turkish and Armenian foreign ministers announced they held a constructive conversation and that they will continue the process of normalizing relations without preconditions. Michal Bardavit, CGTN, Antalya.
In other news from around the world, China's President Xi Jinping has attended the closing ceremony for Beijing's Paralympic Winter Games in the National Stadium, otherwise known as the Bird's Nest. More than 500 athletes from more than 40 countries and regions took part in the Games. The president of the International Paralympics Committee said they were a great success. So-called Chainstown is about 30 kilometres from the centre of Chinese megacity Shanghai. Built with British design in mind, the town offers a slice of the UK in China. Wang Siwen takes us for a tour.
On the outskirts of Songjiang district, there's a tiny village with a certain international flair.
For those who want to get away from the hustle and bustle and venture out for a day from the city center, one part of the city you don't want to miss is Chainstown.
Chainstown boasts classic British architecture, Victorian terraces, Tudor-style houses and cobblestone street. It's part of Shanghai's One City, Nine Towns initiative, a project where city planners build communities for residents to live outside of Shanghai and relieve the city's population pressure. From Gothic-style church to statues along with rows of shops and even telephone booths, the town has combined a variety of British elements into one little community.
Chainstown is a British-style town. Now it is an open community with its own homes, school, church, galleries, business and recreational areas. For our residents, if they never go abroad, they can still visit the town here to feel the atmosphere.
Wu says the town's heyday was in 2008, with more than 50,000 to 60,000 people coming every day. COVID-19 has affected tourism, but Wu says visitors are finally starting to come back.
Brides and grooms decked out in their wedding gear. The biggest draw for Chainstown is offerings of a backdrop for engagement and wedding photos.
For anyone wanting to escape the city grind or get a glimpse of Britain, this town has something for everyone. Wang Sun, Chainstown, Shanghai.
And that's the world today. Thanks for watching. We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. In the UK, we're also on Freeview 24 hours a day. More news is coming up at the top of the hour, but next it's To the Future Together, a China Media Group special marking China and the UK's 50 years of ties. For now, from all the team here in London, goodbye.